Hi everyone, Stu Becker here. Today we're going to be taking a look at my WETech G36C GBBR, which has developed a problem again that I've experienced before. I've had this replica for over 2.5 years and done a few repairs on various pieces in that time. So what's the issue this time? Towards the end of the last skirmish session I took it out for, it started to perform a bit sluggishly, the working parts were no longer fully cycling to the rear, and therefore it isn't chambering a fresh round each time as a result. So as you can see, you're only getting about that much movement on the bolt, so the nozzle isn't even retracting, so it can't possibly chamber a new round. So this is due to excessive wear on the internals, which is no surprise really, given how I used to put as many as 20 full magazine loads through it in quick succession once a week or so, trying to set speed records when I take it to KOAS off shop in Jubei and play on their indoor gun range one night most weeks before I moved to Taipei. So it's had a hell of a lot of use basically. The root of the problem is the internal fire control group mechanism. I've got a spare one here, so it's this hammer striker at the front of the valve striker that causes the problem. So let's get inside and I'll give you a rundown of where the problems are. Okay, first take off the magazine, of course, but leave the action cocked. Then push out the two body pins, part numbers 130 here and here. Occasionally they're a bit stiff. Okay. So they hold on the magazine well, as well as the fire control group right here. You can put them into the two holes provided in the stock. I like how this breaks down easily. So magazine well levers off, fire control group comes out. So here's the fire control group in the housing, that's part of the pistol grip and the trigger assembly. I currently have this second-hand FCG from a teammate's donor project gun installed due to the excessive wear on the sears on the original one here, which I made somewhat unusable. Now, I did install WETech steel parts in the original FCG when I refurbished it before, including the hammer, part number 75, the trigger, part number 70, the main sear inside, part number 71, and the valve striker unit, which is the problem part here, made up of part numbers 81, 82, 83, 85 and 139. But I found the sears didn't quite function as well as the original and tended to snag a little or prevent proper trigger reset. So I swapped that out, refurbished the FCG for this spare when the opportunity arose. So what's the root cause of the issue? The gas required to send the pellet down the barrel, downrange, and cycle the action afterwards is vented from the magazine when the valve at the top rear of it, this bit here, is struck by the internal hammer acting upon the valve striker assembly. So this whole sub-assembly, the hammer pushes that. This tends to wear down. So the whole assembly wears out, particularly the head of the striker here. You can see it's greyed on this one. The whole unit is black, but because of the wear it's fresh metal. So that tends to wear down. That's part number 82, which is the striker head, and that's the very part which pushes the head of the valve in the magazine itself upon firing. Which is why I replaced the unit in my original FCG here with the WETech reinforced steel parts when the original stock parts wore out, like this one the first time round. So this is my original fire control group, which I refurbished. That's the WETech part. You can see the difference there. It's much chunkier and shinier, bare metal, because it's a reinforced part. It's more physically durable and obviously much larger than the original parts. You can see them there. So the hammer inside goes forward and pushes this against the magazine valve on the back of the magazine to release the gas, like that. So now the stock parts of my second vanilla FCG are worn down as well. I'll transplant the WETech internal reinforced steel parts from the valve striker unit out of my original FCG into the newer donor one, and hopefully that should remedy the problem. So, to start with, we need to get the FCG out of the pistol grip. So we have to remove the fire select levers, part number 103, part number 105, from both sides to allow the whole unit to come out. So, put it into automatic, so that they're facing upwards. Both sides have grub screws holding them in, so this one here, they're 1.27 millimeters or 0.05 of an inch, so you need an Allen key for that size. So loosen them off. They transfer the movement of the levers through these geared teeth, which then operate the sear inside. So undo them, but when you do this, be careful, because under each lever there is a spring, part number 84, which pushes on a ball bearing, which is part number 147, against the side of the body to engage these three little divots, which are inside. I'll show you those in a minute. So just be careful when you take them off, so that you don't lose the bearing and the small spring with it. So if I leave that in there. So there's the spring, and you get a small ball bearing with it. So be careful not to lose those on both of them. And here are the divots on each side that engages with. So 1, 2, 3 for your selector positions to give you a positive lock. Okay, so other side as well. All out as one unit with the bearing and the spring. So those two fire select levers out. The only thing holding the fire control group in now is this Phillips head screw at the back. So if we take that out, that is part number 146. Okay, and now the whole thing just comes out like so. So once you've done that, the toothed selector gears will probably fall off. So just be mindful of that. Even if they don't, it's probably best to take them off yourself and lay them to one side. So the next thing in our way is the bolt hold open device on the front of the fire control group, this bit here, which gets pushed up by the tabs on the back left of the magazine when they're empty to hold the bolt open. So that's part number 95 on the front of the FCG. And then the tabs on the back of the magazine here. You see these are empty, they're already sticking up. Normally if they're full they'll be flush, they stick up and push up on this to hold the bolt open. So there's a screw at the front, flathead. Just undo that. This is part number 96. So, take that out and pull the whole unit off. Be careful not to lose the return spring in the front end here. It's quite small. That's part number 97. So pull the whole thing off. Upwards, keep the spring to one side as well. Okay, so that's now clear. Okay, so next we need to remove this side panel here. That's part 90, which basically holds in place this auto trip sear thing here. So this slider bar, part 80. So once it's doing automatic fire, the bolt pulls that forward, which drops the hammer. If you've still got the trigger depressed, it then drops the hammer as well. So from the auto sear position, that drops. Okay, so we need to take that off. So unscrew those two here. So these two screws are part number 142. And then the panel itself is part 89, so we take that off, stick it to one side. Okay, so under this panel, okay, that's just fallen off as well, this is your SEER reset bar, the auto reset. So under the panel are more of the SEER interacting reset parts. So part number 91, return spring, part number 92. So that pushes up internally due to interaction with the internal trigger mechanism. Be careful of it flying out again because this is under tension, so lift that and be careful of the spring popping out like that. Okay, take those out onto the side. So the spring is part number 98, return spring, and this is part number 94. So with all those parts removed, we can now move on to the top plate here, which covers the valve striker. So remove these two screws. These are part number 142. Retain that plate with your finger just so it doesn't fall off. Okay. And now the plate itself, which is part number 93. The best way to do this probably is to push up on this section at the front, unseat that, and then follow it around with a screwdriver. There we are, lever that off like that. Okay, so that's part 93. Now be careful because again there's a return spring that flies out underneath that. So now you can see the valve striker unit here, the original one. So we'll take that out. You see this face here is worn, so this bit pushes up when you first insert the magazine so that it doesn't just go off. When you cock the weapon it pulls back, that sits behind the valve, and then when you fire the hammer pushes it into the valve. Okay, so with both my fire control groups pretty well stripped down as far as I need to, you can see the difference now between the original valve striker unit and the upgraded WETech one. Not just the colour, but particularly part 82 here at the front is much more substantial in the WETech unit, and obviously it's made of steel as well, so it's not going to wear as easily. Part 82 is the front, the rocker part, the actual striker. Part 81 is the whole chassis that it's in. Part 85 is a little nub at the back that the hammer actually hits, so obviously if that wears down you can replace that as well because it's a wear part. Part 139 is a little pin that goes through to hold the rocker and the valve striker in place. And inside there's part 83, which is the return spring for this flapping action. So I'll take the WETech replacement one and stick it into my current fire control group now. One thing I've only just realised is that this reset component, part 91, has actually fractured on the in-use fire control group. So I'll swap that out for the spare that I've got from my donor one. The reason this is broken probably because of the amount of wear on it. It's a reset component. It's got a wear face which is replaceable here, held in by this screw, and this whole thing is then retained by the spring. This small nub here interacts with a pawl on the hammer itself. So the main hammer body, part 75, has this small pawl inside which kicks up against that. That pushes up against the bottom end with this surface here. When the hammer is recocked, it pushes this up, and this is pushing down on the top of the valve striker here, keeping it forwards and pushing gas through the system until the hammer's fully recocked. That small pawl kicks this up and allows this to slide back against spring pressure and reset. So that's why there's a wear surface on the original parts as well, built into it, because that's pushing against this component all the time, which is probably why it's snapped in the other fire control group. Reassembling the fire control group. The valve striker subassembly moves back and forth in this slot in the main body, but before you reinsert it, the return spring, part 86, needs to go in there as well. Don't confuse it with part number 92, which is for the reset part number 91. So also, very important, this small piece here part number 87 is a travel limiter, which prevents the valve striker moving too far. That actually goes inside the spring and sits in it like that, so make sure that's all in place before you put that into this smaller track at the bottom of the main track where the valve striker travels. So that goes in like that. Okay, you can see the limiter just in the bottom there. So the valve striker now goes in. The main body has a nub on it which interacts with that spring. Sits like that. Now you've got to get part number 93, the top plate, back on without all this springing apart. So you might need to use some pressure to push that forwards and hold it there without the spring flying out. And then seat that on top, snap it in. Okay, and now part 142, the screws can go back in, they hold the whole thing together. So next up is the reset arm, part number 91, which had apparently broken in the other fire control group. So that seats into this gap here, so the neck part to the top with the replaceable wear surface on, that fits in there like that, in this slot. And then carefully put the return spring, part number 92, in to the track in the middle of that. Maybe use a flathead screwdriver to help you push it in. And make sure it doesn't spring out. Hold your thumb over it like that and hold the whole part down in position. You also need to make sure that the bolt release button, part number 94, goes in at this point, because when we put the cover on we won't be able to get to it. So that seat's back up in there. Also make sure, unusual for it to happen, but sometimes these springs underneath part number 98, they might spring out as well, so push that back in there, try and hold it all in. And one other thing, just to make things more complicated, the auto sear reset bar, part number 90, needs to go back on at this point as well. All these three things are held under this side plate. So with all that back in place, part 89, this side plate with this hook for the auto sear bar, that can go back on as well. Make sure everything's seated under there. So you might need to use a screwdriver to help push this in. Make sure it's in place. Make sure the sear bar doesn't wander off. Okay, so the sear bar is in place and the parts underneath. So now part number 142 again, the side screws can go back in. And the other one at the back. So now the whole thing's back together. So the auto sear trip bar drops the hammer onto the main sear when the bolt goes forward. Then when you pull the trigger, part 91 drops down as the hammer goes forward, and that allows the main striker to be hit and pushed forwards. Then when you recock the hammer, part 91 jumps up and allows the valve striker system to drop back, cutting off the gas, but only once the hammer has been fully recocked by the system cycling backwards. Next up, the bolt lock arm itself, which holds the bolt open when the magazine is empty. So this needs to go over the front here. Important thing, the return spring is very small. That's part number 97. So place the spring on the nub of the arm and then maneuver into place. I need to use a screwdriver to free up the front end of it, and there, it goes back into place. Now the main screw can go in, that's part 96, that goes through the front here. And tighten that up. Okay, that's back in place. So now bolt locks back when the magazine's empty. Put a fresh magazine in, push the release button, that levers that arm down, drops the bolt. Next step is to reattach the geared transfer wheels, part number 104, which sit inside the fire select levers on both sides and rotate with them to transfer the rotating action to part 106, this main sear selector unit here. so that selects for safe, semi, full auto. With this, it's important to make sure everything's aligned correctly. So part 106, make sure it's turned all the way clockwise to the front. That's the full auto setting, which we'll reassemble it in. Then the geared teeth wheels, the transfer wheels, can go on both sides. Notice that there's a flat face at the top, which has the grub screw still in. That wants to be parallel to the top of the fire control group. And on the inside, there's a track which sits inside the divots here, so there's like a raised section that goes in there. So line that up like that. So okay, so the flat section is parallel to the top, and do the same thing on the other side. So raised rim inwards and flat grub screw side parallel to the top. Okay, hold that all together, and now you can put all that back inside the main body of the fire control group, so they line up with the holes there. So now just reinsert the main retainer screw, part 146, at the back. Tighten that down, so that's back in place there, and then we can attach the fire control levers, making sure not to lose the ball bearing and spring in each one. So they reinsert like so, and then just tighten the grub screw in the top on that flat piece. Okay, that one's in. So full auto, semi, safe. So safe, semi, full auto. That reset latch drops back. Okay, and then the other side as well. And tighten this grub screw, part number 125 in each case. And there we are, fire control group back together. So safe, it won't fire, semi, hammer drops, and the valve striker comes out. Hammer resets, valve striker goes back in. That's all back together. So final stage, just the field strip for reverse. So first, fire control group in, because this won't clear the magazine well. So fire control group goes in, magazine well locks on these lugs at the front, and then swings back into place, and put your retainer pins back in. 1, 2, back together. So check fire control group's working. Okay. Much stronger response now, so clearly the valve striker was the problem, and perhaps the fact that part 91 was broken and I hadn't even realised. So that's all back together and functioning properly.